Death shouldn't have been this quiet. That was the first thought that crossed my mind. 34 years of slaying monsters, winning wars, making the impossible possible, and the thing that finally killed me was none of those. It was the blade of the man I trusted most. I knelt on the cold stone floor, one hand pressed against my chest, and looked up at Seraphim. 14 years I had fought beside this man, trusted him with my life, called him my closest friend, and now he stood over me with a sword and trembling hands and eyes that didn't tremble at all. He spoke quietly, almost gently. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice trembled, his hands too. My voice came out flat. No anger, no grief, just the quiet exhaustion of a man who had already done the math. How many people knew about this plan before the night? A long silence stretched between us. Then he answered, "Vane, the Emperor, and the others." "You sold all of them," I said quietly. "Not just me, Lyra, Dorian, every single one of us." The color drained from his face. "I don't forgive you, but know this. One day Ardric will do to you exactly what you did to me. And when that moment comes, you'll feel exactly what I'm feeling right now, and no one will be there with you." The world went dark. But just before the darkness took me completely, a voice, no direction, no source, as if the stone itself was speaking. "A fascinating end," it said, "but it doesn't have to be." Darkness, then nothing. Not peaceful nothing, just absence. Nobody, no weight, no pain, no sound. And across from me, a figure, long white silver hair, perfectly still despite the absence of wind, a face of impossible symmetry, ageless, expressionless, carved from something older than the concept of age itself, white eyes, and at the very center of each a single black point, small as a needle tip, no warmth, no coldness, simply present. It spoke, "You can call me Silent." "Death?" I asked. I had no voice here, but the words formed anyway. It answered calmly, without hesitation. "Death is a door. I'm closer to the architect." Then, after a pause that could have lasted seconds or centuries, "I've been watching you for some time, Kael Dawnless." I didn't waste time on questions about where we were or what this place was. I said the only name that mattered, Lyra. Silent waited. "She's still alive," I continued, "but they sold her too. Seraphim gave them every name, every single one. And Aldrich, the Rift, he's keeping it open deliberately. Every generation people die fighting it, he stays on his throne, untouched. You know this." "I know," it said again in exactly the same tone. "Then why?" "I cannot act," Silence said simply, "but you can." The words landed like a stone dropped from a great height. Then it offered quietly, "Go back, everything you know, everything you've learned, everything you've become, take it with you." I was silent for a long moment. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want in return?" Nothing comes free, not even from architects. Something passed across Silent's face, fast, so fast I almost missed it. Something that looked almost like hesitation, almost. "The price, you'll understand it when the time comes." "That's not an answer," I said. "No," it agreed quietly, "it isn't." I thought of Lyra, I thought of the Rift, I thought of 34 years and every single choice that had led me to a cold stone floor and a trusted blade. "Yes," I said, "send me back." Silent raised one hand, and on my left wrist, even here in this place without bodies, a mark appeared, black and silver lines thin as smoke curling just beneath the surface like something alive. Then, just as the darkness began to dissolve, it spoke one final time. "There is a fifth. You haven't counted them yet." And then, light, my eyes opened to ceiling, a cracked ceiling with a water stain in the upper right corner, brown ring, old damage, never repaired. I knew this ceiling. I had stared at it on 100 restless nights 18 years ago. "Academy dormitory, second floor, third room on the left." I sat up slowly, my hands. I stared at them for a long moment. Young hands, 16-year-old hands, no calluses from years of sword grips, no pale lines of old cuts, no weight written into the skin from decades of carrying things too heavy to name. I pressed one hand flat against my chest, no wound. I stood and crossed to the small mirror in the corner, cracked at the lower left edge, always was, never fixed, and I looked at the face staring back at me, 16. Sharp features not yet fully hardened by time and war, dark brown hair falling slightly across my forehead, the same face I had carried for 34 years, just earlier, before everything. But the eyes were wrong, not in a way anyone else would notice, same gray-blue as always, nothing unusual on the surface, but behind them, visible only to someone who knew what to look for, weight, the kind that doesn't belong in a 16-year-old's face, the kind that only accumulates over decades of watching people die and carrying the memory of every single one. I looked down at my left wrist. The mark was there, faint, nearly invisible against my pale skin, black and silver lines thin as spider silk, curling just below the surface, like something written in a language that predated language itself. "A fifth," Silent had said. "You haven't counted them yet." I filed that away. Later. I took one slow breath, the breath of a man who has steadied himself before 100 battles, who knows that the moment before action is the most important moment of all. Then I looked at my reflection one final time. "All right," I said quietly, to the empty room, to whatever was listening, to the 18 years stretching out ahead of me like a second chance sharpened into a weapon. "Let's do this properly." The academy corridor. Morning. Warm golden light poured through tall windows, catching dust motes floating in the air. Students moved in clusters around me, excited, nervous, loud with first-week energy. Every face carrying the particular expression of someone performing confidence they didn't quite feel yet. I walked with my hands in my pockets and watched them the way a general surveys terrain before a battle. The red-haired boy on the left, firebrand. Couldn't control the temperature variance yet. Small burn marks on his left sleeve from this morning's practice. Third year, a field mission, a structural collapse. He wouldn't make it. The girl near the fountain, Windbrand, exceptional natural instincts, already moving through the crowd more efficiently than anyone around her, recruited into the Emperor's special unit by year 5. Nobody leaves that unit. The quiet one standing alone by the east call? Kael! I heard him before I saw him, that warm, carrying voice, the kind that fills rooms effortlessly, the kind that makes everyone nearby feel like they're being included in something good. Seraphin came toward me through the crowd, golden hair catching the morning light, wide, easy smile already in place, the picture of someone you trust without a second thought. He reached me and dropped a hand on my shoulder, comfortable and natural. "Where were you last night? I came by the room." "Couldn't sleep," I said. My voice came out easy, slightly tired. "Exactly right. Walked for a while." He raised an eyebrow and grinned. "Nervous about the evaluation? You, of all people? Should I not be?" He laughed and fell in a step beside me. "You're going to destroy it, and you know it. I'm the one who should be nervous. Light brand against whatever you're about to do." He kept talking. I listened to the shape of the words without quite hearing them. I was watching the small things instead, the way his eyes moved when he wasn't actively smiling, the slight tightness around his jaw when he mentioned the evaluation, the way he tracked the other students in his peripheral vision without appearing to. Things I had seen 1,000 times across 14 years. Things I had never once registered. You're already watching, I thought. Not fully activated yet. You haven't been given your first real assignment. But you're measuring, cataloging, filing everything away. So am I. He glanced sideways at me and said with a slight frown, "You seem different this morning." "One beat. Just one." "Slept badly," I said. He held the look a moment longer than necessary. Then he smiled again, warm, easy, practiced, and the moment passed like it had never existed. It happened in the middle of the corridor between one step and the next. Nothing dramatic, no sound, no flash of light, just a sensation, sudden and cold, like a finger pressed against the inside of my left wrist from beneath the skin. My steps didn't slow, my expression didn't change. But my left hand, tucked in my pocket, curled slowly closed. The mark was warm. This early? I thought, why now? And then, for just a fraction of a second, less than a blink, I saw it. Not a memory, not exactly. More like a window opening briefly onto somewhere else entirely. A small room, sparse, a girl's belongings, a stack of books with cracked spines, a worn canvas bag hanging from a hook, a single pressed flower tucked between 2 pages of the topmost book. Empty. All of it, perfectly, silently empty. And at the very edge of the frame, just barely visible at the bottom corner of the window, gone. I blinked once. The corridor snapped back around me. Morning light, student voices, Seraphin talking at my side. My wrist cooled. I knew what I had seen. I didn't need to see the rest of it. Lyra, I thought. First year, end of semester. That's the window. I recalculated quietly, completely, in the span of exactly 3 steps. The timeline was tighter than I had hoped. Seraphin glanced at me and said, "Are you even listening?" "Every word," I said. The great evaluation hall, 100 students arranged in a single line stretching the length of the room. I stood near the middle and watched Master Vane work. He moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had performed this exact ritual hundreds of times, stopping before each student, observing their brand activation, making small, precise notes in his ledger, moving on. His expression never changed, professionally warm, the practiced patience of a man who understood that the appearance of kindness was its own form of control. I knew every single layer beneath it. 14 students, I thought, watching him gently correct a nervous first-year stance with steady hands and an encouraging word. 14 students you sent to assignments they weren't ready for. Not personally, never personally. You write the assessment, you flag the potential. The Emperor's office makes the final call. Your hands stay perfectly clean. You sleep well at night. I used to find that confusing. I don't anymore. My turn came. I stepped forward. Vane looked up from his ledger, and for just a fraction of a second, something shifted behind his eyes. A sharpening, the particular quality of attention that appears when some unexpected presents itself. He already knows my name, I realized. Someone briefed him before today. They started the surveillance earlier this time. He said, in the same tone he had used for the 99 students before me, "Brand activation." I raised my left hand. The void brand activated, controlled, measured, deliberate, perhaps 30% of its actual capacity. Enough to register as exceptional, not enough to register as a threat. Around me, the air pressure shifted subtly. 2 students on my left took a small unconscious step backward without knowing why. Vane's expression didn't move, but the hand holding his assessment pen paused for exactly 1 second, no more. "There it is," I thought. He looked up and said in perfectly measured tones, "Exceptional, advanced track placement." "Thank you, Master Vane," I said. I stepped back into line, eyes forward, expression carrying exactly the right amount of quiet satisfaction, the look of a student who performed well and knows it, nothing more. Inside, I was already 3 steps ahead. The assessment report goes to the Emperor's office within 48 hours. Aldrich's response comes within 3 days after that. By the end of the week, I will have the full attention of the Imperial Surveillance Network. Good. Better to be watched by the enemy than ignored by them. You cannot redirect something you cannot see. Watch me all you want, Vane. I'm watching back. The Academy Gardens, late afternoon. Warm golden light filtered through the leaves of an old oak tree, scattering patterns across the stone path below. Most students had gone inside by now. The evaluation was over, the results posted, the initial shock of placement either celebrated or quietly swallowed. The gardens were almost empty. I sat alone on a stone bench near the eastern wall, back straight, hands resting on my knees. To anyone watching, I looked like a student decompressing after a long day. I was actually updating a mental map that was 18 years in the making. Footsteps, light ones, careful, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned early that approaching people unannounced rarely ended well. I didn't look up immediately. I let the footsteps get within 5 meters, then said, "You can sit down." A pause. Then the footsteps resumed and a small figure came into my peripheral vision and sat on the far end of the bench, leaving deliberate space between us. I turned to look. 15 years old, petite build, dark navy wavy hair framing a pale face, large dark purple eyes watching me with an expression I recognized immediately, the specific wariness of someone who has learned that most interactions end in disappointment, but who hasn't yet given up on the possibility that this one might be different. Lyra, something tightened in my chest. I kept it off my face. You were gone by the end of first year, I thought. I was 300 miles away when it happened. I told myself I couldn't have known. I told myself that for 20 years. I knew, I just didn't look. She spoke carefully, testing the ground. "You're the one with the Void brand. Most people lead with something more subtle," I said. Something flickered at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile, quickly controlled. "I'm not very good at subtle," she said. "I've tried. It doesn't suit me." "What suits you?" She considered the question seriously, which I hadn't expected. Then she answered, "Direct and quiet, mostly quiet. The Void brand absorbs other brands, copies them, neutralizes them." She paused. "That means you've never been able to train with anyone without the risk of draining them. Every sparring partner, every instructor, they all have to hold back around you. Or you have to hold back." She folded her hands in her lap and said quietly, "That must be incredibly lonely." The garden was very still. A leaf drifted down from the oak tree and landed on the stone path between us. I had been called many things across 34 years. Dangerous, exceptional, indispensable, a weapon, an asset, a problem. I had been thanked and feared and ultimately betrayed. No one had ever used that particular word. "You read about Void brands," I said finally. "Everything the library has," she said, "which isn't much. 3 references, all of them vague." A small pause. "You're the first one I've ever seen. And your conclusion after extensive research was that I'm lonely?" "My conclusion," she said carefully, "was that the brand creates a kind of fundamental separation from everyone around you because you can never fully engage without risk." She tilted her head slightly. Was I wrong? I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said, "you weren't wrong." Then she said, "I'm Lyra. My brand is Mist." "I know," I said. She blinked. "How?" "The assessment list was posted this morning." "Oh." Then, after a moment, "Most people don't bother learning the names on the lower tiers." "Mist isn't a lower tier," I said. "It's a misclassified one." She went very still. "What do you mean?" "Mist doesn't just obscure, it alters perception, changes what people see, hear, feel. In the right hands, it's not a support brand, it's one of the most strategically complex abilities in existence." I turned back to her. "Whoever told you it was weak either didn't understand it or didn't want you to." Lyra stared at me. Something was happening behind those large dark eyes, something recalibrating. Then she said very quietly, "Why are you telling me this?" It was a good question, a careful question. The question of someone who had learned that information given freely usually came with a price attached. I stood up from the bench and said, "Because it's true." I started walking back toward the dormitory building. Then I stopped without turning around and said, "The Eastern Archive opens at 6 in the morning, before most students are awake. The section on Miss Brand documented cases is on the 3rd shelf, left side. The Academy doesn't advertise it." "Don't let anyone tell you what your power is worth, Lyra." I walked away. Behind me I heard nothing, no response, no movement, just the sound of the garden settling back into its afternoon quiet. But I knew she was still sitting there, staring at the space where I'd been, and I knew she'd be at that archive at 6 in the morning. Dormitory, past midnight. The room was dark except for a thin line of moonlight cutting across the floor from the gap in the curtain. Everyone else in the building was asleep. I sat at my desk with nothing in front of me, no paper, no pen. Everything I needed was in my head, where no one could find it. I ran through the list. Seraphin, not yet an active agent. His formal recruitment wouldn't happen until 2nd year, triggered by a specific event I remembered clearly. For now, he was performing friendship with enough genuine warmth that even I couldn't always tell where the performance ended. That made him more dangerous, not less. Keep close. Don't reveal anything. Let him think he's reading me.
Vane, the assessment report was already written. I had seen it in his eyes the moment the pen paused. It would reach the Emperor's office within 2 days. Aldrich would respond with interest. By the end of the week, I would be flagged as a priority observation subject. This was exactly what I needed. An enemy watching you openly is an enemy you can manage.
Aldrich, the center of everything, 58 years old in the prime of his political power, untouchable behind 5 layers of loyal apparatus. He had kept the rift open for 30 years by the time I died. Every solution I had tried in my previous life had failed because I had moved too late with too little against too much. This time the approach will be different, slower, more patient, more complete. The rift itself, 5 brands, the convergence ritual. The formula was in the restricted archive. I had found it once before, too late to use it. This time I knew exactly where it was and exactly what it required. Void, mist, iron, light, fire. 5 brands, 5 bearers, 1 night.
I had all 5 in reach. Theoretically, Vane carried iron, and Vane was the enemy. Seraphim carried light, and Seraphim was the enemy, which meant the ritual required me to either turn 2 enemies into allies or find 2 different bearers of the same brand types. Neither option was simple.
And then there was the 5th thing Silent had said. There is a 5th. You haven't counted them yet. I've been turning that over since I woke up. My list had 4 names on it, 4 threats, 4 variables, 4 people whose moves I needed to predict and redirect. Silent had said 5. Who was I missing? There was a gap. There had always been a gap, a period of roughly 8 months in my second year at the academy where certain events had happened that I couldn't fully account for. A reassignment I hadn't understood, a death that had been ruled accidental, a file I'd been denied access to and then forgotten about because there were always larger fires to fight. 8 months, second year. Someone was moving in that window, I thought. Someone I never identified. Someone who was already in position before I was even looking. Opened my eyes and looked at the moonlight on the floor. All right, I thought, one problem at a time. First, survive first year. Protect Lyra. Let Vane's report reach Aldrich and manage the attention that follows. Map Seraphim's activation trigger and stay ahead of it. Second, find the restricted archive formula and secure it. Third, identify the 5th. I stood up from the desk and crossed to the window. The academy grounds were silent and silver under the moon. In the distance, just visible above the tree line, the faintest smudge of deeper darkness against the night sky, the direction of the rift. Even from this distance, even after 18 years away from it, I could feel it, a low vibration at the back of the teeth, a wrongness in the air. I'm coming, I thought, not to the rift, to the man who was keeping it open. Just not yet, not until everything is in place. I let the curtain fall and went back to bed, closed my eyes, slowed my breathing deliberately, the way soldiers learn to sleep in war zones, not because rest comes easily, but because you understand that exhaustion is its own kind of enemy. Within 3 minutes, I was asleep. 2 days later, early morning, I was crossing the main courtyard when I felt it. Not the mark this time, just instinct. The particular quality of stillness that falls over a space when someone in it has just received significant news. I looked toward the administrative building. Master Vane was standing on the steps. He was speaking to a younger instructor, quietly, professionally, the way he did everything. His expression hadn't changed, it never did, but his left hand hanging at his side had closed into a loose fist. The response came, I realized. Aldrich replied faster than last time. I kept walking, same pace, eyes forward. I crossed the courtyard and went through the east door and didn't look back. In my head, a clock started. The Emperor's interest had been confirmed, which meant the next phase would begin within days, increased observation, possibly a direct contact attempt through one of Aldrich's proxies, and almost certainly an escalation in whatever Seraphim had been tasked with learning about me. The opening moves were done. The real game was beginning. The Eastern Archive. Dawn. The corridor was empty at this hour, pale gray light just beginning to press through the high, narrow windows, the kind of light that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be morning. My footsteps were quiet on the stone floor. Not deliberately quiet, just a habit of someone who had spent decades moving through spaces where noise had consequences. I turned the corner into the archive wing and stopped. Lyra was already there. She was standing in front of the 3rd shelf on the left side, one hand raised toward the spines of the books, not quite touching them yet. Her bag was on the floor at her feet. She hadn't heard me arrive. I leaned against the doorframe and waited. She found a section, pulled out a slim volume, older than the others, the spine cracked with age, opened it and started reading. I watched her face as she read. Most people, when they encounter information that reframes something fundamental about themselves, go through a visible sequence: surprise, then resistance, then a kind of suspended moment where the mind decides whether to accept or reject. It usually takes several minutes. Lyra went through it in about 30 seconds. Her expression didn't change dramatically, just settled, like something that had been slightly misaligned her entire life had quietly clicked into its correct position. Then she looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. She didn't startle, just looked at me for a moment, then looked back at the book, then said, "You knew this was here." "Yes," I said. "You've read it." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then she said carefully, "The documented cases go back 400 years. Every single one was either executed or disappeared within a decade of their brand manifesting. The Academy has been classifying Miss Brand as a support tier since the 3rd Imperial era." She paused. That's not a coincidence. No, I agreed. It isn't. Why? She said. Not a question exactly, more like the beginning of a much larger question she was still assembling. I crossed the room and sat down at the reading table and said, because a brand that can alter perception at scale is a brand that can make people see things that aren't there, believe things that aren't true, question orders they would otherwise follow. I looked at her. Empires don't survive that. Lyra sat down across from me. She placed the book on the table between us and looked at it for a moment. Then she said, so they taught us it was weak so we'd never learn to use it properly. They taught everyone else it was weak, I said, so no one would think to watch for it. She absorbed this in silence. Outside, the first proper light of morning was beginning to come through the windows, warm gold now, the gray giving way. It caught the dust motes above the table and made them look briefly like someone intentional. Lyra said quietly, why are you telling me this? You asked me that yesterday, I said. You didn't really answer. I looked at her for a long moment. She held the look steadily, which most adults twice her age couldn't manage. Because you're gonna need to know it, I said, and because no one else is gonna tell you. She was quiet for a while after that. Then she opened the book again and started reading from the beginning, and I sat across from her in the early morning light and let her read. We stayed there for an hour. Neither of us spoke much. It was the most comfortable silence I'd experienced in 34 years. 4 days after the evaluation, afternoon, I was crossing the western corridor toward the practice halls when someone fell into step beside me. Not Seraphin. I always knew Seraphin's footsteps by now, the particular rhythm of someone who moved like the world was watching and enjoyed it. These were different, measured, professional. I didn't turn immediately. I let the person match my pace for 3 steps, then said, whatever you're about to say it. A pause, then a voice, young, male, carefully neutral, said, Master Vane requests your presence at the administrative building at 5th hour. I turned to look, a third-year student, clean uniform, straight posture, expression trained into blankness. A courier, the kind that Vane used when he wanted distance between himself and a message. Tell Master Vane I'll be there, I said. The third year nodded once and peeled away without another word. I watched him go. 5th hour, I thought. Not a request. A summons dressed as a request. I turned back toward the practice halls and kept walking, same pace as before. The clock in my head adjusted. Faster than last time, I thought. Aldrich's response must have included specific instructions. Vane isn't waiting. He's been told to move quickly, which meant the Emperor wasn't just interested. He was impatient. Good, I thought. Impatient people make mistakes. 5th hour, administrative building, 3rd floor. Vane's office was exactly as I remembered it, neat to the point of severity. Every object on the desk placed with intention. The single window positioned to put the visitor's face in the light while keeping Vane's in shadow. A small, precise architecture of control. I sat in the chair across from his desk and waited. He studied me for a moment in silence, the particular silence as someone taking a measurement. Then he said in that warm, professional tone that never quite reached his eyes, I'll be direct with you. Your assessment results were remarkable, genuinely remarkable. I've been doing evaluations for 22 years and I have not seen a void brand activation at that level in a student your age. I've recommended you for the advanced cohort, he continued, accelerated training, access to restricted practice facilities, direct mentorship. A pause, from me personally. I kept my expression at exactly the right level of careful gratitude, the look of a talented student trying not to appear too eager. Inside, I was watching everything, the angle of his shoulders, the placement of his hands on the desk, the specific word he had chosen, remarkable, which was a word designed to make someone feel seen. There's one additional component, Vane said. His tone didn't change. The advanced cohort participates in a quarterly review, progress reports assessed by an external panel. Another pause, this one fractionally longer than necessary. The panel includes representatives from the Imperial Assessment Office. There it was, not hidden, not disguised, just placed there on the table between us like it was the most natural thing in the world. The Emperor wants eyes on you directly, he was saying, and I'm the one delivering you to him. I looked at Vane for a moment. He looked back at me with that professional warmth, that practiced patience, that expression of a man who had never in his life made a decision he couldn't justify on paper. I understand, I said. When does the cohort begin? Something very small shifted in Vane's expression, so small that anyone who hadn't spent 34 years learning to read faces would have missed it entirely. Satisfaction. Monday, he said. I nodded and stood and said, I'll be ready. I walked to the door. Then I paused with my hand on the frame and turned back slightly as if something had just occurred to me. Master Vane, the external panel, is there anything specific they look for in terms of preparation? Vane smiled, that warm, steady smile. Just be yourself, he said. That's more than enough. I know, I thought that's exactly what I'm counting on. Dormitory. Late. I sat at my desk in the dark and thought about the 5th. Vane, known. Seraphin, known. Aldrich, known. The Rift, known. 4 variables, 4 threats, 4 moving pieces I could track and predict and redirect because I had watched them for decades in a previous life. The 5th was something else, something that had moved through the 2nd year of my previous life without me noticing, which meant it had moved carefully or it had moved in a space I wasn't watching, or both. I thought about the reassignment I hadn't understood, a student I couldn't remember the name who had been moved from the general cohort to a specialized unit mid-year for reasons that were never explained. At the time, I had filed it as administrative, normal, the kind of thing that happened in large institutions without meaning anything. Now I wasn't sure. I thought about the death rule accidental. A third-year bridge collapse during a field exercise, 3 students lost. I had been at the memorial. I had stood there and felt the appropriate grief and then moved on because there was always something larger demanding attention. But one of those 3 names, I couldn't bring it forward completely. It sat at the edge of my memory, almost visible, like a word you know but can't quite say. I pressed my fingers against the mark on my wrist. It was cool, quiet. "Show me," I said quietly, to the empty room, to whatever silent had placed beneath my skin. Nothing happened.
I hadn't expected it to. The mark didn't work like that. It wasn't a tool I could operate on demand. It showed me what it chose to show me, when it chose to show it, which meant Silent had built something into it that I didn't fully understand yet. Another variable. I added it to the list. Then I closed my eyes and went through everything I knew about the second year, the missing 8 months, the gap in my memory that kept refusing to fill, and I stayed there, turning it over carefully, until the moon moved past the window and the room got very dark and very quiet.
Somewhere in the academy, a clock struck midnight. One problem at a time, I told myself. You have time. For the first time in 34 years, that was actually true. The advanced cohort training room, early morning, 12 students, hand-selected. Vane had said, the best from this year's evaluation across all brand types. I arrived exactly on time, not early, not late. I took a seat near the middle of the room, angled slightly so I could see both the door and the instructor's position without appearing to watch either. Students filtered in around me. I cataloged them without looking directly at any of them. Firebrand boy from the corridor, Windbrand girl from the fountain, 3 others I recognized from the evaluation line. Seraphin came in 4 minutes after me, caught my eye across the room and smiled, and took the seat 2 to my left. Of course, I thought. Of course you're in the advanced cohort. I smiled back. Easy, warm, the smile of someone genuinely pleased to see a friend. Then the door opened one final time, and I stopped. A girl, 17, maybe 18. Tall, lean build, dark red hair cut short and practical. A scar along the left jawline. Old, well-heeled, the kind that came from something that had happened years before academy age. She moved into the room with a particular economy as someone who had learned not to take up more space than necessary, and she took the seat farthest from the door without looking at anyone. I knew her face. I knew it with the specific certainty of someone who had stood at a memorial and looked at a photograph on a program and then carried that image for 20 years without knowing why. She was one of the 3 names from the bridge collapse. She was supposed to be dead. I kept my expression completely still. I looked away from her at exactly the right speed. Not too fast, not too slow, just a student glancing around a new room. Inside, every calculation I had built over the past 4 days was restructuring itself around a single new fact.
She didn't die in the bridge collapse, which means the bridge collapse wasn't an accident, which means someone faked her death, which means she has been operating somewhere under some identity for the past. I did the math. If she was here now in this cohort at this age, she had been hidden for approximately 2 years before my previous life's timeline even began. Hidden, trained, and then inserted into this specific program at this specific time.
Someone placed her here, I thought. Someone with enough reach to fake a student's death, hide her for 2 years, and then position her in the one cohort that has direct access to the Emperor's assessment panel. Not Vane. Vane was a loyal instrument. He didn't have the imagination for something this layered. Not Seraphin. Too young, too recently activated. Aldrich, I thought, or someone operating at Aldrich's level who isn't Aldrich. The 5th, not a threat I had missed, a player I had never identified at all. Vane entered the room and called the cohort to attention and began speaking about the structure of the accelerated program. I listened with the appropriate expression of focused attention. Across the room, the girl with the scar sat very still and looked at nothing in particular. She hadn't looked at me once, which I was realizing was itself a kind of answer. Break period, corridor outside the training room. I positioned myself near the water basin at the end of the hall and waited. 12 students exiting the room, the social sorting that happens naturally in any new group, the clusters forming, the hierarchies establishing themselves. Seraphin was already at the center of a loose circle of 3 others, warm and magnetic as always. The girl with the scar came out last. She turned left away from the main cluster and walked toward the far end of the corridor. I gave it 15 seconds, then I followed. Not obviously, there was a practice schedule board at the far end of the corridor that I had a legitimate reason to consult. I stopped in front of it and studied it without reading a word. She stopped 2 meters away, also apparently consulting the board. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then she said without looking at me, "You've been watching me since I walked in." Her voice was low, flat, not accusatory, just stating a fact. "Have I?" "You're good at not looking like you're watching," she said, "but you blinked wrong when I entered, just once." I turned to look at her directly. She turned to look at me at the same moment. Up close, the scar along her jaw was more visible, a clean line, precise, not from a fall, from something edged. Her eyes were a very dark green, steady, the eyes of someone who had learned to see without showing that they were seeing. "Kael," I said. "I know," she said. "Mira." She offered nothing else. No brand type, no origin, no explanation for why she was here. Just a name, delivered like a closed door. I nodded once and looked back at the schedule board. The advanced cohort has a joint session with the Imperial Assessment Observers on Friday, I said, as if making conversation. I know, she said again. Have you met any of the observers before? A pause. Very small, the kind that someone less attuned would miss entirely. No, she said. It was the first thing she had said that wasn't completely true. I filed it carefully, said nothing, kept my eyes on the schedule board. After a moment, she turned and walked back toward the training room. I stayed where I was and watched the schedule board for another 30 seconds before following. In my head, a new file opened. Mira, unknown brand type, officially deceased, bridge collapse, second year, 3 years ago, currently active, inserted into advanced cohort, position for Imperial assessment access, connected to someone with significant reach, aware of surveillance, highly trained, not young enough for her listed age, and lying about her connection to the observers. The fifth, I thought, not an enemy's weapon, something more complicated than that. Evening, Academy Common Room. The fire was going, warm amber light filling the space, the comfortable noise of a dozen students unwinding after a long first day of advanced training. Seraphin had somehow already made himself the social center of the room, which was exactly what Seraphin always did and always would do. He dropped into the chair across from me and said, grinning, "So, what do you think? About the cohort? About everything." He leaned back, comfortable, expansive. Vane, the program, the Imperial observers. He paused, then added more casually, "The new girl." I looked at him. He held the look with that open, easy expression, completely relaxed, the picture of friendly curiosity. There it is, I thought. That's the assignment. Find out what I know about Mira. I said with an easy shrug, "The cohort seems strong. Vane runs a tight room." "And the girl?" Seraphin pressed lightly, conversationally. "Quiet," I said. "Seems focused." "You talked to her in the corridor?" "We both looked at the schedule board," I said. "Barely exchanged names." Seraphin smiled. "She's interesting," he said, in the tone of someone sharing an observation rather than probing for one. "Different from the others." "Most people are different from the others," I said. "That's what makes a cohort functional." He laughed, genuine, warm, the laugh I had known for 14 years, and let the subject go. But I had seen what I needed to see. Whoever was running Mira was already running Seraphin's attention toward her. 2 pieces on a board pointed at each other through me. Elegant, I thought, without admiration. Whoever you are, you think several moves ahead. So do I. That night, my room, I was almost asleep when the mark activated. Not the gentle warmth from before. This was different, sharper, more urgent, a cold brightness beneath the skin that pulled me fully awake in an instant. I sat up. The room was dark, empty, still. The mark pulsed once, and I saw it. Not a room this time, not a place at all. A face. She was standing somewhere I didn't recognize, in front of someone I couldn't see, and she was saying something I couldn't hear. But her expression, I could read that clearly. She was afraid. Not the surface fear of someone facing immediate danger, the deeper kind, the fear of someone who has been afraid for a very long time and has learned to function inside it, but hasn't learned to make it stop. Then, gone. The mark cooled, the room came back, dark, empty, still. I sat in the silence for a long moment. She's not the fifth, I realized. She's not the threat. She's the... I stopped, rearranged everything. She's trapped, I thought. Whatever she's been inserted into this cohort to do, she didn't choose it. Or she chose it under conditions that weren't really a choice, which changed the calculation entirely. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling. Same cracked ceiling, same water stain, same brown ring that no one had ever bothered to fix. One more variable, I thought, one more person to account for. The fifth wasn't a what, it was a who. And the who was someone operating above Mira, above Seraphin, possibly alongside Aldrich, or possibly in opposition to him. Someone I had never identified in 34 years of fighting in this world. Someone who had been there the whole time. I closed my eyes, find the fifth, I thought, protect Lyra, stay ahead of Vane, let Aldrich think he's watching me, and figure out what Mira's running from. The clock on the wall ticked quietly in the dark. Outside, somewhere beyond the tree line, the rift pulsed, low, steady, patient. It had been waiting for 30 years. It could wait a little longer. The Imperial assessment observers arrive at 9th hour, 3 of them, all in dark formal coats bearing the Emperor's seal, a small gold insignia on the left breast, subtle enough to be missed, obvious enough to be recognized. They moved to the academy with the particular ease of people who understood that every room they entered rearranged itself around them. Vane met them at the main entrance and walked in personally to the advanced training room. I watched from the corridor above through the high window. 3 figures crossing the courtyard below, Vane half a step behind, his posture carrying that specific quality of a man performing deference to people he considered beneath him but couldn't afford to show it. I recognized 2 of the observers immediately, senior assessors from the Imperial office, both of them present in my previous life, both of them loyal instruments of Aldrich's apparatus, both of them exactly where I expected them to be. The third figure I couldn't see clearly from this angle. Dark coat, similar build to the others, head slightly down against the morning wind. I moved to a better position. The third figure looked up, and I stopped breathing for exactly 2 seconds. I knew that face. Not from this life, not from the academy, not from the evaluation, not from anything that had happened in the past week. From the end. From the last year of my previous life when the war against the rift had reached its final desperate phase, and we had been reduced to a handful of people making decisions that couldn't be unmade. From a meeting in a ruined building 300 miles from here where someone had spread a map across a broken table and said, "This is what we have left, this is what we can still do." And the person standing across that table, the person whose plan we had followed, the person whose judgment I had trusted more than almost anyone else in those final months, was walking across the academy courtyard 20 years before we were supposed to meet. How? I thought. The word was very calm in my mind, the way thoughts get when the mind is moving too fast for emotion to keep up. How are you here? How are you here now? You were 19 when we met, which means right now you should be... The math resolved itself. Right now, they should be approximately my age, 16, maybe 17, which meant everything I thought I knew about them was built on a foundation that had been constructed for me to find.
The mark on my wrist burned, sharp, sudden, the sharpest it had ever been.
And then the figure looked up, directly at the window where I was standing, directly at me. From 3 floors below, across a courtyard, at a window I was standing slightly back from, they looked directly at me and did not look away. I was in my seat in the advanced training room when the observers entered. Same position as always, middle of the room, angled for full visibility. Same expression, focused, attentive, the look of a serious student. Inside, I was rebuilding everything from the ground up. The observers took their positions along the right wall. Vane introduced them briefly. Names I filed automatically, ranks I already knew. The third figure stood at the end of the line. Up close, the face was younger than I expected and exactly as I remembered simultaneously. The particular paradox of seeing someone before they became who you knew them to be. Same sharp eyes, same quality of attention that felt like being read rather than looked at. They didn't look at me again, which was its own kind of message. Vane began the session. Students activated their brands in sequence, demonstrations, assessments, the observers making notes with small, precise movements. Normal, procedural, the ordinary machinery of institutional power. I performed when my turn came. Controlled, measured, 30%, same as always. The observers wrote things down. The third figure wrote nothing, just watched. When the session ended and students began filtering out, I stayed in my seat slightly longer than necessary, adjusting my bag, reviewing nothing, buying 40 seconds. The third figure was the last observer to leave. At the door they paused just briefly, just a fraction of a second longer than a natural exit required, and said, without turning around, pitched low enough that only I could hear it, "You blinked wrong when I walked into the courtyard."
The same words Mira had used, then they were gone.
I sat in the empty training room for 3 minutes after everyone had left. Then I stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard and thought with great deliberate care about everything I believed I knew about the person I had just seen. And then I thought about how much of it they might have built specifically for me to believe. In my previous life, we had met in the 3rd year of the final war. They had appeared through a network of resistance contacts, vouched for by people I trusted, carrying information that proved accurate enough times to establish credibility. They had become one of the closest strategic minds in our small remaining circle. When I died, when Seraphin's blade went in, they had been 300 miles away on a mission I had personally authorized. I had never questioned that. I was questioning it now. Every piece of information you brought us, I thought, every strategic recommendation, every contact you vouched for, I ran through methodically, one by one, testing each against what I now knew. The answer was uncomfortable. Most of them had done both, which was the signature of something more sophisticated than a simple double agent. A simple double agent feeds you false information. What I was looking at was something that had fed us true information, genuinely true, genuinely useful, while simultaneously steering the overall shape of the war in a direction that had ultimately ended with 12 people in a room and a blade in my chest. Not an enemy, not an ally, something that operated in the space between those two words where the most dangerous things always lived. I looked at the mark on my wrist. It had cooled again, back to its baseline, that faint silver-black shimmer just beneath the skin. You knew, I thought, it's silent at whatever silent had placed in me. You showed me the void. You showed me Lyra's Noom. You showed me Mira's fear. And now this. What are you trying to tell me? No answer. The mark stayed cool and quiet. I picked up my bag and left the training room and walked back toward the dormitory through corridors that suddenly felt like they had more eyes in them than before. I found out their name through the simplest possible method. The observer registration list was posted in the administrative corridor. Standard procedure, all visitors to the academy logged for security purposes. I walked past it on my way to the evening meal and read it without slowing down. 3 names, 2 I knew, the third Ren, Imperial Assessment Division Junior Analyst. I kept walking. Ren, I thought, that's not the name I knew you by. In my previous life, they had introduced themselves with a different name entirely, a resistance name presumably, the kind people adopt when they want to move through a conflict without their real identity attached to their actions, which meant the name I had known them by for the last 3 years of my previous life was a construction, which meant I had never known their real name at all. I sat down at the evening meal across from Seraphin and listened to him talk about the assessment session and ate and said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments and thought about a person named Ren who had been watching me from a courtyard this morning and had somehow known exactly which window I was standing behind.
You've been briefed on me, I thought. Someone told you I was worth watching specifically, someone who knew I would be here, in this cohort, at this window. Who briefed you, Ren, and what exactly were you told?
That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and ran the new map, all the pieces, all the connections, all the lines between them that I could see and the ones I couldn't. Aldrich at the center, Vane and Seraphim as his instruments, the rift is his mechanism of control, Mira is someone else's piece trapped inside the same apparatus, and now Ren, junior analyst, Imperial Assessment Division, real name unknown, operating at an intersection of every major force in this board simultaneously.
And Silent's words, still sitting there unanswered, there is a fifth. You haven't counted them yet. I had assumed the fifth was a threat, a hidden enemy, an unidentified player working against me. But what if the fifth wasn't against me? What if the fifth was the reason I'd been sent back at all?
I pressed my hand flat against the mark on my wrist. It was warm, not the sharp, urgent warmth of a vision, just a steady, low heat, like something waiting. Show me, I thought. Show me what I'm missing.
For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, not a vision, not a flash of somewhere else, just a voice, Silent's voice, heard not with my ears, but with something deeper, something that vibrated in the bones of my wrist where the mark lived. You're asking the wrong question.
I went very still. What's the right question, I thought back. A pause, long, the kind that made me wonder if it would answer at all. Then, not who is the fifth. Another pause. What did the fifth send you back to find?
And then the warmth faded and the mark went cool and the room was just a room again, dark, quiet, a cracked ceiling with a water stain in the corner that no one had ever bothered to fix. I stared at it for a long time.
Not who, what, outside, beyond the tree line, the rift pulsed patient and vast and waiting, the way it had been waiting for 30 years, the way it would keep waiting until someone finally understood what it actually was. Maybe that was the question, not who opened it, not who was keeping it open, but what it was actually for. I closed my eyes, sleep didn't come for a long time.